Hey YouTube, Derek D.C. Phillips here, author of Frightful Fables, Tales That Will Leave You Screaming for More. I have a very special video for you today. This one features a piece of historical fiction that I wrote, and it focuses on the case of the Atlanta Ripper. Now, if you're interested in true crime and that's why you came to this channel, I'm sure you're probably 100% familiar with every detail available about the case of Jack the Ripper, but for some reason, the case of the Atlanta Ripper did not receive as much attention, although it did occur around the same time, a little bit later, but around the same time. Now, I do want to point out that this piece mixes historical fact with storytelling fiction, so real century-old events, places, and people are detailed, but some liberties have been taken for the sake of the narrative. Many of these sites are still standing. You can find them on Google Maps. You can go visit if you're in town, and I have provided a list of resources in the description in case you're interested in further reading. So without further ado, let's get into the case of the Atlanta Ripper.
Each of the Ripper victims were slain in a similar manner, a slash in the throat producing instant death with an ugly wound in the vicinity of the heart. The Florence woman met her death the same way. Her throat was slashed cleanly from ear to ear, and the heart had been cut out and laid upon the body. If you guessed that excerpt came from one of London's periodicals in the late 1800s, you'd be wrong. These words were, in actuality, printed a couple of decades later, an ocean and many miles away. Far removed from the old world's bustling streets and smog, a presumed copycat set his sights on another, younger hub of commerce. The above appeared in the Atlanta Constitution on August 11th, 1912. By all accounts, at least 8 Atlanta women were viciously murdered by the same pair of hands between 1908 and 1912. Even more were attacked, and the final count varies depending on who you ask. Emma Lou Sharp would become one of the few survivors who lived to describe their encounters with the madman, while her mother would become victim number 6. Of course, neither Emma Lou nor her mother Lena had any way of knowing when they parted ways on July 1st, 1911. The night would have been swelteringly hot and still. According to sources, the East Coast experienced all-time highs that year, driving people to do unspeakable things. In the midst of a heat wave that warped train ties and prompted many to sleep outdoors, even in chillier northern climes, police records attribute such unusual incidents as meat cleaver attacks and roof-leaping suicides to insanity stoked by blazing temperatures. Born and raised in the South, Emma Lou was no stranger to perspiration. She, like the rest of her neighbors born into an age of limited electricity, had found her own coping mechanisms, like the cool washcloth she twisted between slick palms. As she stepped down from the stoop of her home on Hanover Street, pinpricks of heat rippled up the nape of her neck. Beads of sweat erupted across her brow, and defiant goose pimples chilled her arms. This Saturday night, tensions ran as high as temperatures. For each of the past 5 weeks, the bodies of young black women, a demographic to which Emma Lou herself belonged, had been found mutilated, bludgeoned, with their throats sliced from ear to ear. Like clockwork, news spread in hushed tones between church pews every Sunday morning. "She's prettier than you," Emma Lou's mama said when the last one appeared on the front page of the local Gazette. The castaway comment made Emma Lou shiver, and she changed the subject immediately. She'd come to dread Saturdays and made a point to decline any invitation that would necessitate her being out past sundown, which is why she fussed under her breath as she set out toward market that evening. It wasn't far, but it certainly wasn't close on foot. Why hadn't Mama stayed in? What was so all-fire urgent about a sack of flour and some eggs? But that's just like Mama, Emma Louise told herself. When she set her mind to something, it had to happen, and on her own timetable. Wasn't no razor-wielding madman going to stop her. She'd like to have caught up with one of those deaconesses in the market is all. And when I see her, I'll give her a piece of my She stopped and quickly stepped to one side. Red dust billowed under an oncoming horse's hooves, and burlesque propositions spewed from its pale driver's mouth. Emma Lou's cheeks blushed, but she pretended not to hear his catcalls over the animal's clomping. Instead, she averted her eyes and locked them on the path ahead. It wasn't prudent to pause for conversation, least of all with a white man who had impropriety on his mind. After all, society was still recovering, in its way, from the riot back in '06. Soon he was out of earshot, and the market skyline was in her reach. Swatting rust-colored earth from her skirt front, she breathed a minor sigh of relief at the familiar sounds of haggling and good-natured ribbing ahead. Although foot traffic was quelled by the neighborhood's collective caution, people were still out and about. This observation bode well, and Emma Lou was sure her mother would be found among them. She made her way from stall to stall, inquiring as to her mother's whereabouts. No, miss. I hadn't seen her. If she had been by, of course Letitia would have noticed. Honey, are you going to buy a bunch of these green onions or what? I got a line waiting, baby. With each dead-eyed interview, desperation expanded in Emma Lou's chest, mimicking the indigo dusk ink blot that grew overhead. She made her way off the cobbled path and back onto the dirt stretch that led home, muttering commingled prayers and curses. And that's when the man appeared. He must have been looming in the shadowed space that separated Cone's apothecary from the shuttered Five and Dime. A single stride of his long legs brought him to stand squarely in Emma Lou's own fixed trajectory. Although his bottom half was spindly, his top half more than compensated. A single thumb vacillated between his taut suspender and a neat, albeit sweat-sopped, dress shirt. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his already dark features. All that gleamed in the cascading darkness was a sinister smile. Emma Lou caught her breath. "Excuse me," she offered, and attempted to pass. The man, however, refused to concede right of way. He stepped to block her path once more, a graceful yet mocking dance. "Whoa now," he said, amused. "How you feeling this evening?" "Just fine," Emma Lou played along. Once again she attempted to move. This time the man took a step closer. Checkmate. With his free hand he reached out to caress her chin. She refused to flinch and now met his leering gaze. From this perspective she could see under the awning of the floppy hat his eyes. "Not to fret," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I never hurt girls like you." The hand at his chest moved to extract something from his shirt pocket, a slender, sharp instrument whose metallic shimmer broke the mesmeric hold he had on Emma Lou. Eyes wide, the young woman barreled forward, nearly sending the man to the ground. Her cries drew the attention of at least one shopkeep, but not soon enough. With a firm hand, the man clutched Emma Lou above one elbow. He slipped the blade past the linen ruffles of her dress and into the soft flesh that covered her spine. As deftly as the knife had entered, it was extracted. The man vanished into the night. Emma Lou was only vaguely aware of the screams that grated her own throat. Oblivious to the trail of blood that spilled from her own wounded back, she pressed on. Braver neighbors now emerged from doorways, while others peered out from behind sheer curtains. Cries of, "Somebody get him! Help her!" and "Police!" rose to create a muffled din. But Emma Lou didn't hear them. Clawing against muggy night air, she willed herself to move. Step by step, she stumbled closer to home. She could make out the gables of her building. Charcoal against the blue-black sky. Hope propelled her forward. "Please, God, please!" The heel of her shoe landed against a sizable stone, and she hopped to clear herself. Looking down, she noticed the deep red puddle that gleamed under moonlight. She stepped closer and squinted, as she had to be sure. This was not mud. Smaller, dribbled lines trailed away from the larger pool, leading to a copse of hostas. Among the greenery lay Lena's body. She had been slashed and dragged to one side of the road, tucked away to avoid immediate discovery. Emma Lou had been so focused on her own mission an hour or so earlier, she likely passed right by, lost in her own world. Now she dropped to her knees and crawled the rest of the way to her mother's side. The older woman's head lolled unnaturally to one side, but her hands had been placed to rest across the open cavity of her heart. For so many weeks, newspapers had reported details of the atrocities as diplomatically as possible. Until now, the white populace dismissed the crimes as another Negro murder. But the carnage that this new Atlanta menace was inflicting on the city drew natural and undeniable comparisons to that of England's storied Jack the Ripper. Following the attack on Emma Lou and the death of her mother, the Constitution ran the headline, "Theory of Jack the Ripper is given further substance," confirming and encouraging the parallels. Conspiracy theorists wasted no time in pointing out further similarities, from the surgical precision of cuts found on victims' bodies to the victim profile of mostly young, unattended women. Rumors surrounding the killer's respective timelines also began to swirl. Jack the Ripper's killing spree ended abruptly in 1888. Was it plausible that he had hopped on a boat destined for the Americas, following an itinerary approved by legendary pirate Blackbeard himself? Might he have stopped for an ale at port in Savannah before carving his merry way up to the capital? In any event, white citizens began to demand that colored detectives get to the bottom of a problem that could no longer be ignored. With growing frequency, white families found themselves affected by the crimes as their housekeepers and service staff, the very backbone of their daily operations, came under siege. As each week passed and a new body turned up, curfews became more stringent and business after daylight came to a grinding halt. The threat of the Ripper lurked around each and every corner, filling darkened alleyways and creeping out into the greater suburbs of the sprawling city, including Grant Park. In the neighboring industrial community of Pittsburgh, leaders within the black community gathered in the basement of Friendship Baptist Church. Following a brief time of prayer and invocation, Pastor Edward Randolph Carter stepped to the front of the intimate space. The room fell silent, aside from a few isolated sobs. Carter scanned the room with his piercing eyes, pausing upon Detective George Bullard, one of a handful of white allies who showed up to support the cause. Bullard paced at the back of the room, watchful over the sea of standing room attendees. With a muted nod, Carter launched into a semi-structured speech that would call the town hall meeting to order. "We all know why we are gathered here this evening," he began. "Unfortunately, this is a solemn occasion. However, even in the midst of the enemy, we shall respond with order and with dignity, and with Christ's love for our fellow man. Amen. We shall not partake of the fruit of discord that is being sown all around us. Rather, let us use this time as one of reflection, forcing henceforth a stronger and more unbreakable bond. Amen." Spirits were lifted, and dialogue flowed in an excited exchange. Churchgoers and business folk were abuzz with strategies to restore security within their community. Through sheer determination and crowdfunding, they intended to bring the culprit to justice. Detective Bullard had justice on his mind too. As spirited talks carried on, he slipped out from the back of the meeting hall and made his way up a flight of unfinished steps to the sanctuary. A single lamp burned from the foyer, casting a shaft of light and shadow down the main stretch between pews. In spite of the still heat, a chill tickled his shoulders. He was the typical detective type. No nonsense, no frills. Something about this case, though, and the conversation he'd had earlier that day in Pastor Carter's prayer closet behind the main pulpit, made him uneasy. "I'm afraid what we're dealing with," Pastor Carter said, "is beyond the church's realm of expertise." A church-going man himself, Bullard attended a Presbyterian church across town. He didn't know what to make of Carter's words, and they circled his mind like a pack of angry bees. He knew there was no intended subtext to Carter's words, but the way Carter described the situation, there seemed to be something beyond the church's control at play, something almost supernatural. Carter shook his head, denying himself this doorway to blasphemy. "I'll leave that to the Pentecostals," he mused with a smile. The smile quickly wilted as Bullard refocused on the task at hand. Carter had instructed him to keep a watchful eye on the premises that night, not to alarm congregants, but he had a hunch that the Ripper would be watching that night. If he was anything like his Englishman counterpart, he'd be enjoying the spectacle of all this, the headlines, the panic, the general chaos. He was, after all, a devil in the truest sense of the word, a sower of discord. Behind Bullard, the first note of a benedictory hymn blared from a spare piano, causing him to lurch in place. Adjourning chatter wafted up the stairs. In a matter of 30 seconds or less, the first pair of feet would make their way up and out. He needed to get a hold of himself. If the Ripper showed up now, he'd be late to the party. Unless, true to form, he had been here all along. A shadow dashed across Bullard's periphery. The detective trained his eyes on the vestibule of the church. A tall figure, back turned and shrouded under cover of a wide-brimmed hat, slipped out the front door. Revolver raised, Bullard dashed down the narrow strip of aisle and nearly overcorrected. He barely stopped himself from launching teeth first to the concrete steps below. Nervous cries echoed behind him, and several noble gentlemen edged their way to the front line. They too brandished weapons that had been well concealed under lapels and beneath waistbands until now. Even so, they were too late. The Ripper had eluded them once more. They would go on like this for some time. A suspect would be identified, an eager public would attempt to pin each and every crime on the scapegoat figure, whether an abusive partner or run-of-the-mill drunk, and the case would inevitably fall apart. Emmylou Sharp herself offered partial identification of a suspect. She claimed to recognize the voice that taunted her on a muggy July night. Her accusation lacked conviction, though, and ultimately charges were dismissed. One of the case's most prominent suspects, Lawton Brown, drew police attention for his personal connections to several victims. Some of these connections were solid, while others were tangential at best. He had, in fact, lived with or courted at least a couple of the Ripper's victims. Although this tie could be explained in that the dating pool consisted of working-class individuals who lived, worked, and even worshipped in the same tight radius, officials were quick to theorize. According to reports from the time, detectives were inclined to the theory that Brown lived with each victim as his wife for a short time, then dispatched her. The same article goes on to draw comparisons between Brown, who suffered from unexplained mania, and the popular fairy tale victim. The detectives believe that Brown suffered from a mania identical with that of the mythical Bluebeard, and that he found a passionate pleasure in the short possession of a wife, and a keener pleasure in murdering her. Ultimately, the eagerness to attribute too many crimes to one killer would be the argument's undoing. Although Brown may have been involved in one or two of the killings, at least as a witness, the concrete evidence against him, like so many other suspects, didn't stick. Eventually, much like the old world's Jack, Atlanta's own Ripper stopped as abruptly as he started. Officials were baffled, and common folk speculated that he must have died, been imprisoned, or moved on, taking his one-man horror show on the road. Although historians and armchair detectives have all but resigned themselves to the fact that both cases will undoubtedly go unsolved for another 100 years or more, the twin terrors provide food for thought. The curious case of Atlanta's own Ripper brings with it a number of associated and often uncomfortable questions. Atlanta is known for many things. Hip-hop and hot dogs come to mind. Then, of course, we have Jimmy Carter, baseball, peaches, and peanuts. But for some reason, these gruesome crimes don't make the list. Why is that? Could it be that Atlanta, coined during the civil rights movement as the city too busy to hate, wasn't really too busy after all? Is it too busy now? As the case of the Atlanta Ripper is revisited, a laundry list of sins must also be revisited by implicit association. As modern onlookers revive sordid sentiments that were once swept under society's rug, they come face to face with a rage that is as old as their very city, one that is embedded in its bulwarks. Whatever the reasoning may be, one thing is for certain. Where there is a Ripper, whether in London, Atlanta, or beyond, there exists visceral memory. A fascination surrounds the past, with its dark underbelly that casts long shadows over contemporary roles and norms. In the words of one of the Atlanta Ripper's later survivors, Jack the Ripper ain't dead yet. As long as the case remains open, his memory stays very much alive.